Hi, and in this video, we're going to talk about the item catalog and how to set up your labor items in the catalog. So what we're doing here is we're setting up the different types of crews you have available for estimating. Each crew will have a cost and a price, so that when you're estimating, all you'll need to do is click the crew that you want to add to the job, estimate the number of man hours, and away you go. Your cost and your price have already been set up for you. Now, of course, you'll be able to flex those on a job-by-job basis if you want, but out of the box, all your crews will come out with their appropriate costs, overhead markups, and prices. Now, in order for this video to make sense, you should have your budget done. You could use our sample crews and sample budgets, and by all means follow along, but the costs and prices won't make sense until you've got your own crews and your own budget set up. So let's take a look. To get to the item catalog labor section, you're going to go on the left-hand side and you're going to click item catalog. Then we're going to go down here, we're going to click labor. Now, if you're using our sample, you'll see this. If you've already put some information in there, you'll see something different. But this is a list, or a sample list anyway, of crews. Now, when you set up your own crews, you'll want to delete all these samples. They're not necessary. They're only in there to show you that that was just sample information and to not really pay much heed to the costs and prices here because it's just sample for you to learn from. Before we dive into a crew, check up here. That's the budget that's going to use to mark up this crew for overhead and to set a price for that crew. Make sure that's the right budget. If it's not, make sure you set your default budget up correctly. We saw that in the last video, but that's here under Estimate Default Budgets. Back to the labor catalog now. Let's open up a crew and see how it's put together. For example here, it's called install labor. Any install jobs that require an install crew, I'm going to use this one. Now you can create as many crews as you want, but don't get too detailed. If you tried to set up each and every crew with their own wage and their own price, you just end up in a scenario where when you're estimating, you had to know exactly the crew that was going to do the job. If you do, great, use it, you'll be even more accurate. But for most companies, they're just going to pick the type of crew, and each crew will have average costs. So here we're going to do an install crew. Units are always going to be hours, but more specifically, man hours. And then if you want, you can put a description, any notes in here, and if sales tax is charged on labor, you're going to want to set that accordingly as well. We're going to jump over here to the tricky stuff. Let's start with average wage. What we're asking here is, what's the average wage per man per hour? And here I've got 18. Now, if you know it, you can type it in. But if you want LMN to calculate it for you, and it does come in handy, and I'll show you in a second, you're going to want to click the calculator. If I click the calculator, it takes me to all the people that I set up in my budget. So if you've set up your own budget, you'll see your list of employees set up here. Now, if my average maintenance crew consists of 1 install foreman and 2 maintenance laborers, then it'll take these wages, divide it up to calculate the average, and it will give me an overtime factor, saving me from having to do that calculation. The overtime factor is going to add a percentage to the employee's hourly wage to cover the cost of occasional overtime. And it knows how much overtime because you put that in your budget. You told the budget how many overtime hours. So we'll click OK. There you go. Now I've got an average wage and an overtime factor for this crew. And again, this is per person in this crew. Unbillable percentage. This is how much time each day the crew spends not working on jobs. So it could be prep time, could be load time, could be driving time. What you're trying to do here is say there's a certain percentage of the day that's not productive, but the crews are getting paid for. So lunch, for example, isn't a good example because you don't typically pay the crews for lunch. But if you're paying the crews for breaks, if you're paying them for driving and you're paying them for setup, which likely you are, all that time is not generating revenue and so becomes unbillable time. Now, the exception to that are companies who bid in full days. So for example, if you bid every minute of the day into your estimates, then your unbillable time isn't very big. It might be 5 or 10%. You're still going to have unbillable for warranty, for mistakes, for training, for anything that's payroll related, not job revenue generating. But many companies don't even estimate loading and setup in the morning or driving into their bids. And if that's the case, you have to factor that time every day, plus mistakes, overages, problems, training, all those other things. Your unbillable is likely 20 to 30% of the employee's time. Labor burden's the next one, and that comes from your budget again. And what that does is calculate how much payroll tax, workers' compensation, etc. do I need to add. So if you're looking at my sample data, it's only a sample number. You may have to update that. But if you're creating one from scratch, it'll read your budget, pull your labor budget burden in from your budget so that it's correct. Then you've got your overhead markup. I can't change this. That's again coming from the budget. So whatever budget I've picked here on this screen is going to dictate the overhead markup that we need to add here on this screen. So labor is going to have to recover its fair share of overhead. And now we can come up with our break even. And we know our break even includes the wages, the overtime, unbillable or downtime, labor burden, so all our payroll taxes, and labor's fair share of the overhead burden it has to carry to pay for all the company's overhead costs. And even better, this number is consistent with the budget, the overhead that you put in there. Now you just got to set the price. You can do that by setting a profit margin from the budget. So what it'll do here is it'll read the profit margin for the budget and add that profit margin to give you your price. This is the default. And the reason it's the default is because it's completely calculated to make your budget become a reality. Here's the cost of labor, here's your company's overhead, and here's the profit margin I need to add to get to the sales goal you set in your budget. So as long as I sell enough work this year and don't overspend on labor and overhead, chances are my budget will become a reality. Not by accident, but because the numbers are calculated to make it that way. But of course, you can always override this if you want. You can set a custom profit margin. Let's say for this type of crew, I want to make 15%. No problem. I can type 15 in there, and as soon as I click off it, it'll recalculate the price. Or I could set a custom price. And by typing it in there, it'll tell me the profit margin I need to add to hit $47.50 an hour. So however you calculate your price, either letting LMN do it for you or setting a fixed profit or fixed price, you can configure each and every crew to have its own billing rate. Now that's the billing rate that we're going to use when we estimate. This is the overhead. That's going to be determined how much overhead each crew has to recover when we estimate. And these will be the costs of the crew that'll determine our labor costs on each and every job we estimate. We set it up once, and now every time I want to use this, I simply add this crew to the estimate. 90% of your work's done for you. Hit us up. If you have questions setting up your labor or your crews for estimating, give us a holler. Either hit us up on live chat during working hours, or go to golmn.com/help and do a search for the labor catalog, or email us at advice@golmn.com. All our support's free, and we really want to make sure your pricing is tight to help you produce the most profitable estimates possible. So be sure to reach out if you have any questions or concerns.